Our last session this afternoon is Tools to Build and Sustain Dispersed Networks of Networks. In this session, we'll focus on topics around common challenges and techniques associated with communication and collaboration of dispersed networks of networks. I'm really pleased to have our two speakers here today. Our first speaker is Dr. Cynthia Parr, who's a technical information specialist in the Knowledge Services Division at USDA ARS, which is located at the National Agricultural Library in Beltsville, Maryland. Dr. Parr received a BS in biology from Cornell and an MS and PhD from the University of Michigan. And at the National Agricultural Laboratory, she focuses on strategic planning, policy, and leadership for open data and big data initiatives. Dr. Parr.
I'm going to be talking today about tools, but before I get to that, I want to say, just coming at the very end of a long day of talks, you tend to want to change what you were planning to say, and so I can say after seeing all of these other talks that they seem to fall into a couple of categories. One is people who are experts in the science of teams or collaboration, and the other is people who have experienced and have learned from those experiences of working in networks or networks of networks. And I fall into the latter category. I don't claim any special expertise in the science of what we're doing. I've just learned by doing. And then the other two kinds of talks I've seen are ones that are diving deeply into particular case studies and talking about the lessons learned from those, and others who are taking more of an overview approach and talking about a lot of different examples, and I fall into that latter category. So I'm going to start by basically focusing on just 5 lessons that I've learned through a number of case studies, and I'll start here and I'll end here as well. So the first one is that data networks and collaboration networks reinforce each other. And so by data networks, these are the kinds of tools that I'm mostly going to talk about. I'm not going to talk as much about the communication tools that collaborations might require. I'll be focusing on data sharing and platforms that help facilitate and cause those networks to actually succeed. We found that it's unrealistic to expect shared standards in that data sharing, at least initially and sometimes ever. It's very important to start with clear stakeholders and well-scoped, potentially experimental projects. These are the sorts of things that NSF is very good at funding. But then move or link those successful approaches into sustainable platforms. So the standard thing at NSF is when you're on a fairly short funding cycle and you spin up some new platform or tool, and then once the grants are over, you either are scrambling to get funding for another round of grants, or it dies and things disappear. And so now at USDA, I'm more in a position to help towards longer term sustainability of at least those successful tools or data sets. I will say that tools that developers use, like GitHub for code repositories and Slack and Telecom scrums, do seem to work well for highly distributed teams. And as I'll mention later, that's not just for people who are working on code, but people who are working on procedures and policy and decision making. And this point has been made multiple times before, that program managers are invaluable. And I will say that this is a lesson that I have seen learned over and over again by a lot of projects that did not start this way but ended this way. So in these case studies, I won't name specifics here, but I will say that several of these started with no notion of having a project manager, and they now have them. So I'm going to start with case studies in the biodiversity realm, which was my original domain of expertise. So this is the world that Gil was talking about earlier today. And in each of these examples, I'm going to name the collaboration network first, so Biodiversity Information Standards, and then within that, the two data sharing or tool platforms that have helped those collaboration networks succeed. Then I'll move to the agricultural world, and don't worry about these acronyms, I'll be explaining them as I go along. ARS is my part of USDA, the Agricultural Research Service, but some of the work that we're doing actually goes beyond just our part of USDA. Ag Biodata goes beyond USDA. This is agricultural biodiversity databases, and so it's partly driven by what's happening at USDA, but it also goes beyond USDA. The Earth Biogenome Initiative is not a project that I personally am working on, but this is an international collaboration that USDA is contributing to. And then finally, AGMap is a modeling community that is also international and funded both by NSF and by NIFA, the extramural funding agency of NSF. So I don't claim that the lessons that we've learned are the only lessons you can learn from these, and let's see, I'm going to focus primarily on the positives. We can talk about challenges in discussion, but I'm going to focus on the positive things we've learned. So my first case study is Biodiversity Information Standards, which is an organization that's been around for about 34 years. The acronym is TADWIG for historical reasons, Taxonomic Databases Working Group. And this is my favorite network of networks diagram. This was in a paper that we published in 2012. And it is actually illustrating data flows between projects. There was a database of about 1,600 databases that TADWIG maintained, and we took those databases and mapped out who was sharing data with whom. And you can see that there's quite a lot of networks that focus on particular kinds of data. So BHL is the Biodiversity Heritage Library, NCBI, of course, is GenBank and its associated databases. And then there are a bunch of dots here that aren't connected at all. And at the time, I was primarily interested in these projects here in the middle that were connected to multiple hubs. And I thought, that's really interesting. And in most cases, those turned out to be particular projects where there was a single, highly collaborative individual who made those connections happen. And then, of course, these bigger hubs relied on a fair amount of funding and sustainable activity, and most of those are still in existence. I really would love to go back now that I've looked at this figure again, and I want to go back and see, okay, of those ones that aren't in there, how many of them still exist? Because my hypothesis would be is that by connecting with these hubs, some of those smaller projects have been able to sustain themselves and be very active and continue to contribute to the overall network of networks. TADWIG is composed primarily of interest and task groups, and their primary goal is to create standards. And so there's an annual meeting. This is the community that I know has been mentioned before. When you're the only person in your institution, you don't have anybody to talk to. TADWIG is the place where people around the world go to talk about the things that they do day to day, but they have nobody to talk to about. So I think it's been a very important social context in which all of this technical work can happen. So I'm going to focus on two of those hubs. The first one is GBIF, and Gil mentioned that earlier. That's the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. And I just pulled this off the website, and so you can see that there's a very large number of different institutions that are publishing data in this aggregated network. Most of those are museums, but some of them are observation networks. They're collecting, at the data set level, 46,000 different data sets. But within those data sets, if you count it up, there's 1.3 billion occurrence records. And again, that's both museum specimens and observation records. It turns out the observation records are kind of swamping the museum records because they're coming in real time. And there's lots of people out there. If I go back quickly, you can see GBIF's network is composed of some sub-networks. So this is the avian knowledge network, and obviously the bird folks are out there adding data, huge numbers, but there's other resources, like I think Leslie was talking about butterfly network, so there's other communities like that that are feeding into GBIF. And I will say, just as a comment, that I think GBIF has been a success primarily because the work of TADWIG developed a standard that everybody eventually jumped onto and agreed to use, and in turn, that has fed back to the work of TADWIG, and so as the network finds gaps or ways that they want to extend that standard, they then go back to TADWIG and hammer out what's needed to do that. Okay, Encyclopedia of Life is the project led by the Smithsonian Institution that I used to work on, and I will say that this also came out of the work of TADWIG in some part, at least the mechanisms that we use. Encyclopedia of Life harvests data from some of these distributed databases. In some cases, those are taxon-specific databases. In some cases, it's the type of data. And over the years that Encyclopedia of Life has been in being, they've moved from being very text and image based, so for every species in the planet there would be the information that we could get in text or images, but it's moved in part due to some work that I did while I was there to focusing more on capturing structured trait data. And again, this is harvested from non-standardized databases, but then brought into this collective whole and is now generally producing great science because it's been brought together in a standardized way. Okay, so let me move to agriculture now. So I'm in the Agricultural Research Service. This is the intramural part of USDA, and there are about 800 different research projects going on in any given year. There's about 2,000 scientists and postdocs. distributed across 90 locations, both in the United States and also a few overseas. And so you can imagine that even though it's a government agency with a fair amount of top-down control over the research that these people do, they're very dispersed, and it's hard to keep them pointed in the same direction, tackling big questions in a coordinated fashion. And so a few years ago, ARS created the Long-Term Agroecosystem Research Initiative, and those of you who are familiar with LTER, this is the agricultural, I won't say equal because they're a little bit different. LTER is also fairly dispersed and not necessarily top-down coordinated. So it's LTAR is a little more coordinated than LTER, but maybe not as coordinated as the NEON network. So they're really trying to find that happy medium. And so it's 18 different sites distributed around the country. Some of them are also LTER sites. The general goal is to study ways to increase productivity of our agricultural systems, increase rural prosperity, while trying to reduce as much as possible the impact on the environment. And so they've selected these sites in different watersheds to try to cover the span of crop systems and other agricultural systems across the United States. There's also, I think, some sites that may be coming online in Canada as well. But it's been a few years, and they've been working very much to build this network to get the cultural systems and the data systems in place. And so the data system that is emerging is called AgCross, Agricultural Collaborative Research Outcome Systems, and it is a network of networks itself. They are basically managing a number of different networks that are focusing on specific domains. So GraceNet has been around for a while. It's greenhouse reduction and something conservation. I'm not sure what it stands for. NuoNet is nutrient research. That's starting to become a thing. And then here's another one, agricultural antibiotic resistance. So these are a bunch of different, fairly disciplinary specific research communities that have now agreed to feed their data into AgCross, which at its heart is both a catalog of all these different data sets, but also they are moving towards integrating the data into a single database. And so in order to do that, they're right now in the process of identifying all the measurements that are being taken across all these sites and all of these different disciplinary networks to create sort of the master catalog. And so that's an ongoing process. They've made the decision to go this way, and hopefully that will accelerate the work that this network can do. And then AGData Commons is what I am managing at the National Ag Library, and we have a part to play here. So AgCross is primarily seeing its role as enabling the research for their own network, and AGData Commons will be the point of access for people outside the network to discover the data, to potentially download it and make their own use of it without necessarily dragging down this platform here. So we're very public-facing, and so they like that. So let me talk a little bit about what AGData Commons does. Our primary goal is to make data more fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. We are also both a catalog and a data repository, so we want to inventory all the data that USDA has funded. But when data does not have a home, we will find a place for it in the AGData Commons. And we're satisfying the requirements at the federal level for open data and also public access to data that's funded for research. We cover a whole span of topic areas, everything from economics to genomics to GIS data. It's very high level, so we don't have specialized tools for the most part to work with the data. We're not a workspace. We're basically an access point. So AgData Commons is itself a network of networks. So AgCross, I already mentioned, has its own networks, but these are examples of a bunch of other networks that are each specializing in a particular kind of data. I'll talk about Ag Biodata in a moment. Green Global is the repository for germplasm information, and so it is a platform that's used not only by USDA, but by other seed banks around the world. I5K I will talk about again in a few minutes, but This got a little messed up, but the AGData Commons essentially is working to connect with our high-performance computing system so that we can store big data and make it easy to reuse. We also connect with PubAg, which is the public access system for our scholarly articles, so we do a lot of linking of the data with the articles that they support. And we're tagging with some keywords that a controlled vocabulary that's been developed that is hopefully going to help standardize the metadata a bit. But in general, we're standardizing metadata at a high level so that we can then feed it to these other more externally facing entities like data.gov, science.gov. We're not yet set up to do this, but we hope to be crawlable by Google pretty soon for Google Dataset Search. And then finally, we're implementing ORCID support, which will be the unique identifiers for each researcher, so that should help a lot. And then finally, Vivo, I won't talk about much, but it's a collaboration tool that is being used at other universities to basically capture the network of researchers and the work that they do. So we'll take care of all of that so that these folks don't have to. They can focus on their research. All right, Biodata is a consortium of about 30 different databases, mostly genomics. They have a variety of different platforms, but they have just submitted a proposal to NIFA, the extramural granting agency for USDA, to try to do essentially a combination between an RCN and also to develop some infrastructure. And that infrastructure would connect them to the AGData Commons so that we can take care of all those other things, compliance, connections to the outside world, and they can focus on building towards standardization within these databases. All right, Earth Biogenome Initiative. I know probably Stuart and other folks here may have heard of this. This is the international initiative to sequence all of life. And so I just throw this up here in part because they have a representative governance structure that includes all of these different international entities with a coordinating council in the middle, some particular data systems and infrastructure around the outside. So I think that fits in a lot with what we've already been talking about. They have very ambitious goals that I won't go into, but the point of this is that USDA's contribution here is going to be to provide resources to sequence 100 agricultural pests that are very important, and they've chosen to use the I5K workspace at NAL, which is an existing data product that they can then reuse to support this work. So they're not going to build new infrastructure, at least we're not. They're going to reuse something that was already in existence. All right, the last case study here is AgMap. This is the Agricultural Model Intercomparison and Improvement Project, and this has been around for a while, funded in part by NSF, and they have done international meetings to coordinate with crop modelers around the world to come up with some standard vocabulary so that all of these different crop models, which all take data in different formats but share a lot of the same variables that go into those models, that they can build translators so that you can do ensemble modeling much like you would see in the weather or climate arena. So they basically now have some tools that can be used, but these have all been relatively short-term NSF or other kinds of funding, and so they can't sustain this infrastructure. And so that's why they're now working with us. And I won't go into the details here, but the idea is that AgData Commons will take on some of the more sustainable things that will enable these distributed data sets that are in different databases to make it easy to discover the data sets that might be relevant for a modeler, to map those, to keep the mappings of those particular data sets variables to ontologies, so that then makes them available through the semantic web, mapping those ontology terms to this unified controlled vocabulary that they already have developed, and then make it possible to quickly search all of this data so that you can download the stuff that you want. So this is just beginning. It is funded. We have a funded piece of it to do a little bit of development work that builds on our current platform to add these tools to it to hopefully make this much more sustainable going through the future. And in the end, if the data here disappears, which I don't think it will because those are all using professional repositories, we at least will have the work that's been done in a sustainable repository platform. Okay, so I'm going to go back to my lessons learned, and I don't need to repeat a lot of this, but I think you can hear from my descriptions that there's definitely examples where we didn't start off with shared standards. We don't really expect that there's going to be shared standards. There may be translators that will help bring the data together in a usable way. In all of these cases, I would say that the creation of a data network has fed back onto the collaboration networks and back and forth. And so having a concrete system for the network to work on has provided real focus for these networks and helped them succeed and decide where to go in the future. And yeah, I think that's all I'm going to say for now. So thanks a lot for listening. Oh, one more thing to say is, as I said, I'm not part of a lot of these projects. These are people who are involved, some of whom provided slides to me, but some of them don't even know I'm giving this talk. So any errors of fact were mine alone.
Thanks for a terrific talk. Our next speaker is Dr. Owen White, professor in the Department of Epidemiology and Public Health at the University of Maryland, Baltimore. Dr. White is an internationally recognized expert in bioinformatics, and he leads a group of over 25 scientists and engineers at the Institute for Genome Sciences, who are collectively responsible for the development of nearly all production-level annotation pipelines, database systems, and tools for automated and manual annotation of genomes and metagenomic data sets at the University of Maryland, Baltimore School of Medicine.
Okay, if I was going to do a case study of case studies, you win. That was very good. And what she presented that you were referring to as the AGData Commons, this is basically a presentation of the biomedical data commons, and we use nearly identical strategies. I will, I think, talk a little bit more about survival tactics of working with consortia and what's involved there after I just sort of introduce the domain. So this is a kind of a classic calendar that's been around for a while, where this is the kind of the timeline that NHGRI, the way it perceives itself, which is one of the institutes within NIH in terms of how it's generated a lot of genomic sequencing. And if I sort of bump to this period in time, there was a point when essentially we were just taking lots of different individual species and generating the sequence for them. And now we live in kind of a different world. So all of these science articles and Nature articles represent projects that I've been involved with. Arabidopsis was a large international effort where they broke up the chromosomes literally of Arabidopsis and had different centers sequencing them, and then down the line. And the theme here is that you would take some charismatic macro species, you know, some individual organism, grind up the DNA, run it through the sequencing pipeline, and run it back into a computer to assemble them all together. The difference started to happen. One of the inflection points was right here with microbiome studies, where you were generating sequence of collections of bacteria. And now we live in a world where you don't have to understand this slide very much, but we take individual tissues and run them through a single cell sequencer and generate a whole genome from a single cell. And the throughput now is just astronomical. So one of the things that I thought would be part of my mission for coming here is to say that we now exist in kind of this world where data acquisition is the name of the game in biomedical science. And originally the human genome took 3 years to generate for a single genome. The Broad Institute now brags about sequencing a human genome every 5 minutes. And so we were looking at having millions of genome equivalents, and there's many implications of this. And it used to be that there were just a few shining genome centers that were generating the data. Now sequencing is just distributed all over the place. What I'm involved with are these really large cloud-based systems. And the other thing to keep in mind is that these are really, from my perspective at least, for really large projects. They're incredibly well funded. So there's a number of things to know now in terms of some of the kind of inflection points that we've kind of hit. There used to be a genome repository referred to as GenBank or NCBI, and that's gone. It's like we have PubMed still, that is the central repository for a lot of publications. Think of it now as that there's now going to be many repositories for that type of information. There's going to be now distributed repositories for storing genomic data. It's not going to be at any one site. NIH has hundreds, let's say, of coordinating centers. Each coordinating center is coordinating across many clinical groups that are generating this data. So I guess just that we're talking about tens of thousands of labs And God knows, I'm just totally guessing with the number of samples that they're processing. But I'm involved with the Brain Initiative project for an atlas of brain cells. And there's hundreds of thousands of these single cell data points that are coming from serial sections from mouse brains and human brains. So it's just an amazing thing. And let me layer on top of this that it won't be long that thousands of hospitals will be using genomic sequencing just as an assay. And that will completely swamp out some of these gee whiz numbers that I've already talked about. So one implication of this is there's now even more, as if there ever wasn't, emphasis on open access for data. And things like you mentioned FAIR, a term I always try to stay away from, but I like the term discoverability. I just would like to, as a taxpayer, I'd just like to know where all these data sets are. There's a high premium on this, but it's actually still incredibly hard to combine data sets from one site to another, as anybody who's running a data commons starts to know. And forget about reproducibility, like the provenance of where this sequence came from. It's very challenging. So let me walk you through one example of this. I represent the NIH Common Fund, which is another institute, and they have on the order of 10 data coordinating centers. And if I look at the data types that are associated with them and put an X in there and say, do they have ChIP-seq or do they have FISH? These are all different sequencing technologies. What you can see here is that there's a big diversity of data. Another implication of this is that if I refer to sequence that came from the RNA of a cell versus the DNA, whatever, I'll call each one of those things an asset. There are many assets that you can find across sites, but the other thing that's really important is there's many assets that are useful in combination with each other. And that's wonderful. You'd like to be able to engage in comparison of data from one place to another. And again, you've introduced this very well, that the life is now about integration of this. So if I were to describe the problem, there is no electronic specification for each individual asset. So there were these great 1,000 points of light pictures of collecting samples from all over the planet, and I'd love to know more about this, but eventually those are, some type of data acquisition that's happening. And my question would be, are those laboratories, have they sort of cracked through the barrier that we have not cracked through, which is just to describe each data collected, each sample that's collected by a device in the same way so you can find them in some way. So and the other issue is that there are plenty of people who are generating these things, but there's no specification for describing all the inventory of all the assets that any one place has. And there is definitely no transport system. So if I want to capture this and capture this, glue them together, go to some computing platform to analyze them, there's not a universal way to do that. One of the things that I want to say is there might be a high premium on all of these things. And again, our previous speaker probably knows this from painful experience. I would label these as being nearly irrelevant technological issues and much more sociological issues about bringing these data sets together. And I'll describe a bit about what that is. So you mentioned metadata. Our life is essentially always, if I'm talking about genome standards, it's essentially about coming to agreement. And one of the things that's very clear is the only way that we can pull together data based on metadata is through community engagement. This is a product of scholarship. I looked up the other day that the Dewey Decimal System has actually been developed for over 100 years, and they had release after release after release. And this is a product of an incredible amount of scholarship, and this is no different. So in the world that I live in, for the disease ontology, just describing things like disease, one of the people that I'll talk about in just a second, who is basically a curator of bringing in control vocabularies that describe disease, and there's many different control vocabularies, is basically working with this constellation of people. And what Lynn Schrimmel has done as a curator of these is to take these really important control vocabularies, ICD-9, which are used by hospitals and describe disease in a certain way, or mesh terms, or OMIM. What she's done is she's created mappings across all of these systems. So she's bringing in these collections of control vocabularies and working with these different centers to be making essentially an interconnected mapping between all of these. And it again, my main thing is that this is really about, you have to do this in consultation with a very large community. one of the things that we get into is this is sort of when I want to be organizing my thoughts around getting a collaboration or a consortium together. I keep in mind that I frame everything in terms of fairness and trust. That's just part of my background, or because I'm a Pisces or something like that. But the idea is that all the stakeholders have to have a vested interest, and we heard lots of people already talk about this. There are problems in lots of consortia that there's actually not that much investment for people to really want to come to the table, so that's pretty hard. One of the big things that I bet you may be experiencing is picture a satellite of data generators or a satellite of lots of different data collection sites. They are faced with the prisoner's dilemma, which is no one individual group can get buy-in across the group, or you can't really start data sharing unless you know that everybody in your consortia are going to participate. And the problem here with this is that usually a lot of people come to the table with a lot of bias. Okay, so getting buy-in for any different approach, it's very hard for an individual center to do that because everybody basically mistrusts each other, and that's a really big deal. So let me just stop for a second before I talk a little bit more about some of what I would consider successful approaches, and just say that when it comes to consortia, I interpret everything in terms of fairness and trust. And backing up a little bit further, I also think about it very much in the context of natural history, where humans were basically faced with two problems: collaborate or compete. You know, like work together or bash open the skull of the people you were competing against. And there's a constant tension in our field of this balance between collaboration and competition, and people having to decide between what they have to do. And in my view, one of the biggest things that breaks through the competition versus collaboration decision has to do with trust. Okay, so I organize a lot of my thinking around trust. So this has already been said, but let me just sing the praises of lots of open access tools like Google Drive, GitHub, Slack. What happens here? You're open about everything, and all your processes and all that development is shared across the group. That is one way to build up trust. Other drivers for success, and again, I'll just point out that this is probably true throughout the course of natural history. What we are doing right now by going to different data coordinating sites is we are essentially a communication team, and we go on listening missions. We engage in physical travel to these different coordinating sites, and we never talk about implementation. We never say, "Jeepers, can I get you to buy into a particular control vocabulary?" Not a chance. We sit down and just listen to their story, and we want to see what their life is like, and people are very, very happy to talk about themselves. And then we can start to determine some incentives for them to want to participate in the larger thing. And often what we do is as a result of this, we disseminate a lot more information about what the consortium is about. And we also make sure that the funder isn't in the room, because people aren't going to speak frankly. So the thing here is you're raising trust by actually just sort of walking a mile in people's shoes. And there's an enormous value to actually just seeing what each participant is actually wants to sort of bring to the table, and you promote buy-in that way. So do not underestimate the value of a communication team. Another example, and people have mentioned this a billion times, is the value of working groups. There is now a sort of a teleconferencing lifestyle that is incredibly accessible. And the one thing I want to mention is that there is both a type of vertical integration where you could be talking about people at the steering committee and what's happening with the boots on the ground, but then you also want people who are sort of peer-to-peer talking to each other, so I'll call that a horizontal communication. And it's a way that when you get people who are from one site and another site that are dealing with the same problems, they're going to open up a lot more, and they're going to value being seen by their peers. So just keep in mind that that's valuable. And the other thing that I would say that it's already been said really is that decisions should not be based on who can attend. Okay, you want to write everything up, you want to publicize. Another thing that hasn't been mentioned, the entire internet was developed based on developing protocols for IP addresses and a lot of different things through the use of requests for comments. The idea behind requests for comments is that they're open. You write something up, you give some people an opportunity to react to it. They're highly iterative, but eventually they help you make binding agreements. I also want to say that academics, for the most part, just don't want to build standards, so this is one way of sort of competing against that. And it eventually triangulates on consensus and community agreement. That's fair, okay? People had a chance to buy in. People had a chance to make comments. So I would just say, keep that in mind as something that's been very important. I'm just sort of, streaming all my different ideas about ways that you can succeed with building up agreements across people. We've already said this a billion times, record everything, disseminate everything, and there's very different approaches to that. What we have done is make use of GitHub, versioning, allowing people to record comments there, a lot of different things like that. Slack, I am a PI of a large consortium that at one point was about 500 people. It shrunk in terms of its scope. The main thing that I did was sit on Slack and answer questions for people across the consortium. And there's kind of a football coach mentality here, where the football coach is talking to every member of the team and actually trying to find out what their life is like and trying to help them understand what the bigger picture is. And I really value that. The other thing is that football coaches is they sort of represent on behalf of the funding agent what they're thinking, and it lets people kind of just do their thing. Anything that you can do to promote that everyone is being seen, consortium-wide meetings, promoting, like throwing funding towards pairwise interactions, recording what a more senior data coordinating group is doing so that could get passed on to a new data coordinating group is very useful in both directions. People value that. We do take advantage of things like newsletters and social media. So another aspect of promoting fairness for us, because we have to do a lot of technical development, is comparisons of different tools that are out there. So we frequently have things that are basically bake-offs. They're objective tests for validating if one thing works. We engage in agile development all the time. This is sort of our lifeblood, and is another way when you're working with multiple groups. In the agile approach, I could go into more detail, actually promotes fairness because there's a lot of bake-offs. There's a lot of comparisons, and you sort of, if you don't like it, you just start over again. Training, we take training very seriously, so maybe what I'll do is just jump to a couple notes that I made. We haven't talked that much about interactions with the end user. We haven't talked that much about developing and creating a larger on-ramp for the community of consumers that's using the data for any of these large networks. This is another important role of documentation. This is another important role for having all that stuff on the web. We engage in a lot of outreach. We like to work with end users, and we like to say this is a training exercise, but our subterfuge is we're actually learning about their usage patterns for interacting with the data. So that translates into use cases that we then build into the website. The last thing I want to mention is do not underestimate the importance of your interactions with the funder. I literally am tasked with writing a health of the consortium report to the funding agent. And I can talk about these are what we consider to be extremely high-risk issues, and they can address them. And also, I did mention earlier, they have project managers now at NIH that I can contact and say, this is a mission-critical issue, and they'll actually act on it. So that's been incredibly valuable. The last thing I'll say about the funders, that they are really excited about what we do from the angle of sustainability, because what we're doing is capturing institutional knowledge for the way that some operations have been doing their thing for 10 years and using that as guideposts for the next data coordinating center that comes along. And they love that idea because the opposite is these sites that are these beautiful repositories, but they're incredibly expensive to operate, and the NIH has a lot of discomfort with the idea of having a 30-year mortgage for any data set that's being maintained out there. So they really like this idea of sustainability, and I'll end there.
Thank you both for really fascinating talks. I want to open the floor now and also open up for those who are watching on the live stream for questions for our two speakers.
I wanted to ask about the reproducibility challenge that you mentioned, but then on the slides at the end, I didn't see how you are actually tackling that problem. But in addition to reproducibility, also replicating the experiments where the data was collected is also another challenge. And I actually participated in one of the National Academy's reports on this issue specifically, which is becoming a huge issue. So what are the ways in which you would suggest that we can handle this, challenge?
I'll go first, and my answer is, as Owen said, we recognize that reproducibility was essentially an impossible goal for us, so we're not explicitly trying to support it, but at the same time, we're doing our best to capture the richest possible information about how the data were collected, and that might involve, and I'm trying to encourage people to do this, it's a culture change, but post your protocols on protocols.io. Post your Jupyter Notebook up on GitHub. Archive your open source software scripts that you use to analyze your things. So we're trying our best to move the entire research community to these standard practices, but it's far from standard. So I think by at least showing people the bar, we may eventually get people to the bar. And just the presence of the data on the web in its rawest possible form, I think, is going to foster reproducibility.
Yeah, so I mean, you can have a very pessimistic view about this, that it's virtually impossible, and then there are technologies that can be adopted that make it better. So, to give you an idea about how impossible it is, one of the things that happens is for any gene that you sequence, you want to compare it to all the other genes that are out there. Okay, the size of those data sets are really very large. And if you want to reproduce how somebody made an annotation to a gene, you need to kind of make a snapshot of the universe and all the position of the atoms at that time point in order to recreate that. And so that's an example of something that's very hard. There are these new systems that are referred to as Docker, which are ways of essentially bundling up an entire operating system. And that ability to bundle up an entire operating system and stage it somewhere, that's really very nice because, okay, you can really recreate what was going on in that computer with respect to generating the output that it did. That's a good sign. The protocols.io digital object identifiers, in terms of being able to assign, here's a data collection, and here's a stable identifier that goes with it, and this data collection may be linked to publications. There's a fighting chance, but there is just an abysmal record in my field of people being able to reproduce what happens in publications. And I know some publishers, some editors of journals, one of the things that they're becoming more strident about is requiring that for submission, people have to also submit all the scripts that resulted in generation of figure 1, 2, and 3. And I'm trying to go a step further than that with the Human Brain Consortium that I'm involved with. For each of these figures, they're linked to a DOI. The user would be able to click on it. They'd be able to go to a repository. They'd be able to unpack these things called Jupyter Notebooks, which are basically glorified scripts that allow you to reproduce things. So there's positive stories, but it's very, very challenging.
And I'll just add on to that it may not necessarily be worth the effort for some data sets. And so, so one of the things I'm trying to promote in our community is classifying your data based on how raw to processed it is and maybe what the risks are associated with the different kinds of data so that you can make those priority decisions about what you need the highest standards of documentation for.
So it's interesting that you mentioned that. It sounds like we're both very much involved in this sort of a concept called a commons. And one of the enticing pitches that I've tried to make to NIH about the value of a commons is that we can start to more objectively track usage patterns that's happening at multiple sites. So how many new users came to their site, how many downloads of the data, how many times did they take that data and move it over to some other resource. And the pitch, I'm not saying we'll do this, but the sweet inducement that we're trying to get them to buy into is that we are basically an objective site that could look at usage patterns and help them establish priority for which data sets they'd want to keep maintaining, which ones they want to just discontinue.
I'm going to hold the online question because it's a little bit off topic.
Okay.
So I have a question, and I'm not sure if it's unfair or not, but I'm so impressed by what you've done. I'm so impressed by the idea of the commons and just the sheer technical expertise and thought that's gone behind this. You've both mentioned users, the end user. One of the things I think about with AccelNet is, networks of networks have the potential to transform how science is being done. I think you're transforming how science is being done. Can you give examples from each of your worlds where you think that these enabling systems that you're building are transforming science?
So I'm going to play devil's advocate and say the jury's still out for the work that we're doing in agriculture. It's really, really tough to find those impacts, partly because there aren't standard ways to collect those metrics, and so I'm working on some, my own research life is like, okay, how do you decide which are the metrics that are important to track and which are feasible to actually monitor? And there's a lot of work that still needs to be done on that. Certainly, a lot of what I focus on in agriculture, and maybe you do too, is that there's the stakeholders who are the researchers who need to have access to the data and be able to reuse it so that they can build on it to do bigger, better science. That's a big mantra that I like to use. But at the same time, we're doing it for society. So we also need to make sure that it's accessible to the outside world. And that's challenging, but there are some success stories. So for example, ARS runs a nutrient composition database, and they've got very, very rigorous procedures where they're analyzing the content of food and putting it out there. And in addition to the research that they're enabling, it's been picked up by Google and also by third-party app developers. And now it's on your phone when you're tracking your diet and your consumption. So that's a success story of one particular database. Now, imagine if you could bring that nutrient data together with sustainable agricultural practice so that you're raising the bar. So that's the vision. I don't think we're there yet, but we're in position to do it.
So it's a good point about the lay public. We actually, when we develop use cases for our documentation site, one of the personas that we always include in there is what happens if a lay person wanted to know more about whatever. But if I was going to give a couple of my favorite transformative examples, there's a large genomic study that's happening out of the UK, and what's amazing there is that they're tying genomic information, the entire genome sequence of on the order of tens of thousands of people, to healthcare records that are the result of socialized medicine. So they track a lot of information, and it's all handled in a much more robust way than we do. The trends that you can see there, they link things like behavior. There's gene loci that are associated with women's choice to give birth before age 30 versus over age 40. And so trends like that are just, when these are presented at meetings, you can hear people gasp in the room that you can find things like that. My favorite example that I had firsthand with developing this data commons is there's a site called Kids First, where they sequence genomes of kids that have mostly brain cancer. And a researcher contacted them and said, can you do a join between your data set and another coordinating site that looks at stuff at the expression level? We've got 24 hours, but if you can show that the variants that this particular kid has, then we would be able to enroll her in another study. And they were able to do that. And again, when I see something like that, it almost makes you weep. The problem is, the coordinating centers were able to do that. They were able to do that because they sort of churned on the data. More on the topic of the promise, what we'd want to do is create this on-ramp so lots of clinicians can do that. But yes, I think I've had the heady experience of seeing some real, what would be a result of these types of changes in the landscape.
I want to make a comment because, the vision of what you guys have presented is so alluring, and I'm the kind of person who's like, yes, that's the sort of thing I'm trying to do in terms of making data accessible, findable, and I think as a professor, just the kind of support I would need, even in my lab where we're pretty savvy about these kinds of things, to be able to truly implement, being able to share our notebooks and our data and everything's perfectly annotated and the metadata are, using the best standards. It's like, it's hard because even when you're motivated and you understand the challenges and you have a lot of the technical skills, you still don't have the time or the support or even the reward of having done it. And I think that makes it hard.
So here's where I'm going to put in a plug for your libraries, because I've already mentioned to somebody else earlier today that libraries are now getting into the data business because, I mean, it's kind of the business they've been in all along. They have the knowledge of how best to go about finding the best practices for your data, finding those data standards. I have curators on my team that will do metadata, that will help with metadata description in order to follow some, most reusable practices. So we're trying, for ag libraries, we're trying to put together a set of discipline-specific best practices so that we can steer people at the planning stages of their research towards those, highly useful, community-driven best practices. Actually, I have a colleague who says, I hate the word best practices. It's like fair, right? So let's just say effective practices that have a community basis. So again, we'll never get there necessarily, but lean on your libraries because they will likely have people who can help. And then also, I guess, the data centers at institutions and research offices should also be beginning to help in this direction.
The stuff that you said resonates for me the most is that I have a colleague who's much more passionate about the training component of this, and he's essentially the co-investigator of this project that I'm talking about. And he has gotten, I don't, if you've heard of the data carpentries, so he was basically one of the movers and shakers of standing that up. And he's gotten into the business of essentially training the trainers. So they what they want is people streaming in to be taught how to essentially teach other people to do these types of activities. And his name is Titus Brown, and where he's coming from is it's the people in your lab who are extremely comfortable with navigating a lot of this type of stuff and are really actually at a stage now, a level of sophistication where they're pretty easy to grab up and get shown how to be using these systems that are starting to emerge in a new landscape. So I will just say that I'm hopeful, and I'm incredibly grateful to the NIH because they're allowing us to put a big component of training into this project. And again, they like it from the angle of validation. It's showing that it's actually being used by people. So we've got funding for a couple of postdocs that are just engaged in data usage of the data that we're putting together, because we task them with, you get some funding, but you also write a report and describe to us where you found gaps, and that helps drive the process forward. So it's hopeful, and I also share your pain. I know it's right now it's challenging for everybody.
Let me open up the floor to any other questions that didn't get asked earlier today. I realize it's late in the day. We've got one online question, but I want to keep the floor open. Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
One more is, what role do you think that AI could have in all this? Because we have some projects with DARPA, for example, in which actually the focus is how to handle huge data sets using AI.
I traditionally have been a very, very blue-collar bioinformatics guy, and it's like I need to structure the data, I need to load it in a database, and so for a long time I was fairly dismissive of natural language processing as well as AI. I've seen some absolutely startling examples. And so we're both tasked and challenged with essentially metadata for describing lots of different things. And the key to joining all data sets now really is the metadata and how do you structure that in a common way. How could I go to eBay and go to Alibaba and ask exactly the same query and get the same results type of thing. AI, I've seen some solutions associated with that of essentially harmonizing in an automated way and then letting curators look at that result to really refine it. It's been mind-blowing. So I think that it's very promising. I will say I don't have any boots on the ground real-world experience with it.
So we've been working with a small data science team to sort of explore these kinds of approaches, and it's been very interesting because I also come from the more, you got to structure it on the way in if it's going to be meaningful. Really, it turns out that a lot of it is just you have to have enough verbiage associated with the data set that you can then use NLP to extract some of these concepts. But the other thing is a lot of the AI techniques require a training set. So all of this structured metadata that we put a lot of effort into creating actually should, hopefully, jumpstart those AI approaches that might take over at some level. The other thing is big data doesn't always have a big schema, or it's all the same data. There's just a lot of it, so it's not that hard sometimes to describe it. So I'm hopeful that I'm pushing really hard on data dictionaries right now, where you actually, in a fairly standardized, machine-readable way, capture what are those rows and columns in this particular data set in a human-readable way so that somebody understands what those acronym means, but then ties it to ontology or some other way so that you can start to, using automated methods, associate the data sets that are related to each other, and then maybe integrate them.
Okay, one final question before we break. This pertains to some of the things we talked about earlier. It can be open to anyone in the room. Question relates to maintaining meaningful network connections and activities across time zones when not gathering at planned conferences or workshops. This individual is building an international network of networks focused on permafrost coastal issues in the Arctic. It involves network members that span nearly every time zone. Could someone possibly touch on feasible mechanisms for conducting monthly web-based meetings across time zones?
So I'll tell you what we've done with TADWIG. So when I was chair of the Biodiversity Information Standards Group, I initiated regular monthly meetings, because they hadn't always been meeting. And then we had to have 2 meetings a month, one for the early crowd and one for the late crowd. And for the chair, that was tough because we really needed to be at both of those. But it was otherwise impossible, because when you have people from Australia collaborating with people in California or, Europe, it's really tough. So multiple time zones for those teleconferences. But then the other thing is Slack. As a semi-asynchronous, synchronous tool, you can capture conversations and respond to them in real time, but then they're also there for people who aren't awake to chime in on later when they want to catch up.
We just try to pick the people that are really congenial and are willing to meet at any time of the day or night, like me. And we say, everybody else pick your time and I'll follow suit.
Yeah.
And that's worked out pretty well between China, Australia, and the Netherlands. So, I think that's I just always say, I'll do it at 2 o'clock in the morning. I don't care, just pick a time.
That's actually a really good rule of thumb in general, is there are plenty of people out there who want to collaborate. So you can just kind of ignore the ones who don't. And that's sort of, it's I hate to say it, but they're going to be left in the dust if they're not willing to work well.
But if they're very important, if they're very important, then I can tell this person is not going to meet after 6 their time, or they're not going to meet before 7 their time. So we say, okay, that person's really important to be in this, so let's just schedule it in that time, and some of the rest of us will just adapt.
Well, I mean, it's another chance to emphasize that we place a pretty high premium on recording everything and making any meeting really a matter of record. And there's a lot of different ways that you can do that. There's a lot of action items that that are outcomes of meeting that we now track in GitHub as GitHub issues. And so there are ways that you can deal with life asynchronously, but let the record reflect it's a pain in the neck that we live on a spherical planet and there's only one sun.
Well, on that note, let me ask you to thank our speakers for 2 terrific talks.